So, coding in progress. All right. Can everyone hear me? Thumbs up if yes, thumbs down if no. All right, good, good. Very happy to see so many here. Thanks for coming. And thank you for the introduction, Charlie. So, topic of today, existential risks and AI hardware. I mean, this is meant as an introduction to the topic and with special emphasis on the hardware. Maybe the biggest advantage of this presentation is, in fact, the discussion. And as Charlie said, feel free to shout out. The way I have rehearsed it is to have approximately 30 minutes where I speak and 30 minutes for questions. So we find out how to do this as we go along. Feel also free to write the questions in the chat. Some disclaimers. Note that this is not any original work done by me. I'm simply putting forth the arguments which I find most compelling. And it's some people think that this is somewhat controversial. And please bear in mind that even though I'm presenting from the way I find compelling, there are very good arguments on both sides here. I hope also I can share the slides with you. There are some references in the slides where you can read more on your own if you feel to. Yeah, so let's just dive right into it, shall we? See if I can make this work. Yeah, I think it's fairly okay to start with why we should care, because that's not obvious to anyone. Hopefully the people here know why we should care. But I find that the arguments on this topic is very often misportrayed in the media. And my aim of this kind of presentation is not to convince you that I'm right or you're wrong. It's more for you yourself to have a more nuanced discussion when it pops up. We should note that with this technology, as with many other technologies, it's a duality aspect. And by that, I mean, we have a huge potential to do good with this new technology, but we also have a huge potential to do bad. And we cannot close our eyes for either the one side or the other side. We have to embrace the duality. Personally, I think as individuals, we may help to mitigate some of the risks which I would like to present today. So what are these risks in a nutshell? Basically two things. We have the alignment problem, essentially that we create something which is more intelligent than us and which we have no control over. Personally, I think the chance of this happening is high enough, so high that some of us should spend some time thinking about how can we avoid such an outcome. And if you put that aside with AGI and everything, we still have the transformative AI. And roughly this is changes that comes about when advanced AI is deployed in a massive scale throughout the society. Just to give you kind of a broader context here, I would like to break down the problem and see where are we in relation to other risks. So if we were to break down this problem, I would like to do this in a way which both Shahar Avin has done, and there are some good articles by Sweeslot and Alan Defoe. We can break it down in three categories, namely accident. That means that someone or something didn't mean to cause harm, but some harm happened anyways. We have the malicious side, and by that, it meant that someone or something intended to cause harm and harm happened. The third category is somewhat not spoken about so much. So this is the systemic risks. Those are risks which are neither accident nor malicious. And these risks come about by shaping the environment and incentives in this ecosystem. In order to understand this, we can use an analogy with an avalanche. So imagine that an avalanche has taken place, and you can ask, well, was this an accident or malicious? But if you look at it from a systemic perspective, you take a step back and you say, okay, I'm not interested if this was an accident or something malicious. I'm more interested in why did the slope become so steep that we could launch an avalanche. And our question then is, how are we contributing to make this slope in this AI sphere steeper to create an avalanche? I think it's comparable to climate change or even war. It's something no one really wants, but it kind of just happens because of the incentives and an environment is shaped in that way. Also note that the systemic risk is very hard to address in a unilateral way. They are collective risks, and therefore there are mutual gains to kind of understand them and address them in common. So we can break it down further in another axis along time. I guess now people understand what now is. It's problems we have today. So if I try to fill out with some examples here, we see that today we have some accidents with algorithmic bias, autopilot crashes. If we look at the malicious side, we have deepfakes and what is called laws, that's lethal autonomous weapon systems. In itself, that's nothing new, but the current technologies accelerate the use of these. On the systemic side, we see that we monopolize markets. And by that, I mean that there are tendencies for big companies to become even bigger as a consequence of using AI. So for example, it's very hard for a startup to compete against Google or Facebook as a whole. These companies are using AI as in a massive scale. And because of their using AI, they just become bigger and bigger and harder to stop or do something challenging with. We can look at soon. So by soon, I mean, it is not impossible to build, but maybe there is no business case today, or maybe we are 10 years away to get the regulations in place or something like that. Some examples of soon on the accident side is automatic detection of nuclear threats. So there have been near accidents where humans have almost pulled the trigger due to detection system. And the kind of fear here is that if we deploy an AI system, which is not 100%, we may cause an accident to happen. On the malicious side, we have cybercrime, in particular, for example, spear phishing. So that is specific people who are accurately targeted, either to blackmail or gain access to these systems. Some people are speaking about erosion of trust. So imagine that these AI systems are so good in targeting you as a person, and that the information you receive has been tailored to you. If there is a malicious actor behind this, it can be very hard to find out what is credible or not. And even the malicious actor could tag or hack into the broadcasters of a news company. And in essence, it becomes very unclear what can we believe and what shall we not believe, because the sources are kind of contaminated. Some things which are often talked about is the labor displacement and the erosion of privacy. So I'm not going to dive in too much into this. And finally, a topic which is kind of close to my heart is the long-term issues. So by long-term, I mean, this may in fact never happen. So it's not very certain that it is happening, but there is nothing in physics or psychology or computer science which prevents these risks which I'm now presenting. So some examples on the accident side is misalignment. I will define that in a moment. And super optimizers. So that is essentially something which optimize one target nearly perfectly. On the malicious side, not too much research has been done. So we don't have any really clear picture of what may come in the very long term. However, on the systemic side, we have some ideas. For example, super stimuli. That is, if something is so fulfilling that you rather would like to do that than to cover the most basic needs you have. So examples can be that you play an addictive computer game and you forget to eat or drink and eventually you die, or you rather be on your cell phone than with your family, things like that. You also have a very interesting case of what is called you get what you measure. You get what you measure is in the sense that it's easier to fulfill the basic needs than the complex needs. And furthermore, it might be easier to convert complex needs into more basic needs than to fulfill the complex needs. And that means that our preferences might in fact be changed in a harmful way. So a couple of examples here. It could be easier to persuade me of what is true than actually helping me figure out what is true. It could be easier to reduce the reported crimes than actually preventing the crimes. Or you can increase my wealth on paper instead of increasing my effective control over resources. So in a sense, there is a lot of way of hacking the system, which is much more easier than to tackle the real problems. And that's what we mean by you get what you measure, essentially. I will give some more examples on this later. But in essence, with this talk, I will try to go a bit more into the dark red areas here. And the others, I think, are important, but they are well covered elsewhere. All right. Let's continue with misalignment. What's it all about? I mean, it took some time for me to understand what was really going on here. So I will try to present this in a way which at least is understandable for me. Hopefully it's understandable for you as well.
Mikael, if I could just interrupt.
Yeah, sure.
We have a question.
All right.
Well, going back to the timeline, what is the range for the timeline? As in, how far is long-term versus soon?
Yeah, so soon, it's not like a very distinct difference between soon and long-term. But soon, I would say within 10 years, approximately. And long-term is after that. That's at least in the way I presented the risks. Regarding the timelines of AI, I will touch upon that a bit later. So we will see some fancy graphs and some nice reports. All right, more questions? If not, just shout out. All right, so there is a really good report by Richard Nguyen. I'm not sure I pronounced his name correctly, which is called AGI Safety.
Sorry about time. Maybe I have something somewhat related once we're covering the topics.
Okay.
What about this is somewhat related to AI, but still not strictly AI. But it will be hard to tell the difference. But what about mind uploading? What's the as far as I understand physics right now, it should be fully technically possible right now.
Yeah, I don't know anything which prevents it. I will not cover it too much in this talk, but just to kind of give an overview, what I mean with AI here is something which act intelligent, and we can go into the details a bit later. So yes, I think mind upload is important. If you read call takes from Holden Karnofsky, he start off the most important centuries with a discussion on mind uploading and why that might be important. And it has some similarities to AI, especially when it comes to copying and things like that. So yes, there might be risks there. I haven't thought too much about it, so I will not cover it too much here. All right. Yeah. So the misalignment. We think that 4 premises needs to be true for this to happen. So firstly, we need to build AIs which are more intelligent than humans. That's the first premise. Second of all, those AIs will be autonomous agents which pursue large-scale goals. Thirdly, these goals will be misaligned with ours, and that means that the agents will aim towards outcomes that aren't desirable by our standards, and there's a trade-off between our goals and the AI's goals. Lastly, the development of such AI could lead to them gaining control of humanity's future. There is a kind of analogy in history here. If you're familiar with the legend of King Midas, everything he touched turned into gold. And when he did that, I'm not so sure that he intended, for example, to make his food and his family into gold. But it turns out it's extremely hard to build good objective functions, which is not impossible to gain. So some of you might be familiar with this report from OpenAI. So here, the goal is to make an AI which wins this game. And the game, of course, you're a boat race. You want to finish the goal first. It's very hard to kind of specify this. So what the researchers did instead was to say, okay, the highest score goes to the one who comes first. So let's optimize for that objective function. And what happened is that during training, this AI realized that, oh, I can collect these fuel cans or whatever there are, and that will give me even more points than if I finish first. Now, this is a very kind of benign example, but if you look into the literature, it's actually very, very hard to specify what we would like to impose on the AI without opening up for gaming the system. Okay. If you look at some pathways to misalignments, there are mainly two. This is something which I found very hard to imagine, so I'll just try to spell it out for you here. So we have the task-based AI approach, and we have the generalization-based approach. So in the task-based approach, we scale up a myriad of models to optimize for each task individual. You can get a long way in areas where you have a lot of data to do this, but there are clearly cases where this is not the case. For example, for CEOs, it's very hard to kind of automate Charlie's work today with today's technology, because Charlie has to take care of strategy, market, who to hire, speeches, and so on and so forth. But there are theories where you can combine different individual tasks to make a system which behaves as an AGI. And Eric Drexler has written a very nice report called Reframing Superintelligence. So if you do this kind of collection, then you will not have the agency. So his argument is that because we don't have agency, we no longer run the risk of having an AGI which we have no control over. So he says almost all tasks can be automated in some way or another. And these we call services. The services can create new service. That's a way of automating the service. And when these services kind of talk together, they can perform virtually any task. And the aggregate is then intelligence. So this is called comprehensive AI services. However, if you think about it, one failure mode here could be that the collective optimization, it's a lot of them, and they pursue simple goals over complex goals, as we discussed. So for example, going to the example where it would like to persuade me to find out what is true, or to make me believe what's true, rather than helping me figuring out what is true. Now, the first one can be achieved with a lot of trial and error. Well, the second cannot. So initially, I think we can overcome this problem by reasoning and say, oh, this doesn't sound too correct. But when the environment becomes too complex, we might not be so lucky. So Paul Cristiano comments on this, and he say, if we go down this path, then the world will go off the rails very slowly without us noticing. Another failure mode is, of course, if we automate research and development of AI, and that could again lead to the development of AGI. The second pathway is the generalization-based approach. So that is when you understand new tasks with little or no task-specific training from generalizing from previous experience. So this could come about from transfer learning of other hungry data trainings. So for example, you train a system, you need a lot of data, but it's not particularly tailored for the task you wanted to do. It could be that when these system grows, they might evolve some sort of general cognition, or some way to plan, or things which we see that the current paradigm with machine learning doesn't have. And by so it could be possible that the generalization-based approach can create jobs like, or take over jobs like scientists or entrepreneurs or policymakers. And it's believed that the pathway to AGI can come from standard factors, which influence progress in AI. That is, more compute is better algorithms is better, and better training data. So essentially, you have the recipe for going down either one or both of these paths. Any questions? All right. So let's continue with.
Yeah. We have one question, Mikael. Apologies.
All right.
Matilda asks about just one question about the first condition you outlined for misalignment to occur. Does the AI have to be smarter than us, or would a sort of equivalent degree of intelligence, but one that's a black box to us, i.e. its reasoning is different to ours and just operates differently, potentially constitute a threat too?
Yeah, I will try to answer the question from my understanding of it, and please correct me if I'm misunderstanding it. So if I understand it correctly, there is the question, if we make something which is less intelligent than us in a general way, should we still be afraid? I think yes, just because the collection of a lot of stupid systems can outperform us in certain ways. And that's why I'm very sympathetic to people working with explainable AI, because the current day we have a lot of black boxes. We don't really know what they're doing. We just see that they're working sometimes they're not working. And since we have no control over them, and if they start to kind of talk together in this comprehensive AI services, then I think that there are things I'm more worried about, but I think it's still important that we try to understand these systems and understand what they are doing on a deeper level. Just shout out if that didn't answer the question, Matilda.
She says thank you.
All right, thanks.
And there's also a comment. The phenomenon of convincing people of something other than the truth is quite well underway and is a big part of the general society / world, it seems. And that's from Vasily.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to that view as well. We should take care to guard the truth somehow. All right. So if we go down the path of misalignment, that can lead us to the so-called gorilla problem, or also called the second species argument. The situation for gorillas can be described in the following way, and that's essentially the future of gorillas as a species is more dependent on humans than on gorillas. So this leads to the question, can humans maintain their supremacy and autonomy in a world that includes machines with substantially greater intelligence? If you look at the difference between gorilla and man, there is some difference in capacity to perform complex tasks. And this is roughly here what I mean as intelligence. There are some formal definitions of intelligence. I don't think that's important for now. We have some sort of understanding of what it is. And yeah, we know like gorillas can outperform us in short-term memory. I think that's beside the point, because if you look at the society, we see that humans are doing more complex tasks usually than the gorillas. And then the question becomes, how does human compare to silicon-based computers, or even something which does light inference or something more exotic? Well, transistors pass signals about 4 million times more quickly than neurons. You get different numbers depending on who you ask, and this is meant as an upper bound. So please refer to the resources if you want to look at the calculation. But even if these numbers are 100 times less, that's a vast difference. So even if AGI never exceeds human in any other way, they will still outcompete us. And we can imagine building the best brain we know in silicon. So some people might say that, well, for Neumann, he was one of the most brilliant here. And if you run his silicon brain for 1 hour and assume that he didn't go mad or anything, that will equal that brain thinking for hundreds of years. Another kind of advantage computers have is what we discussed earlier. An AGI is copyable, and that could lead to what is called collective AGI. So for example, we can imagine a system where training or developing the AGI could be very expensive, but running it is much, much cheaper. And it's much, much cheaper than to copy it up to several copies of this and run it on different instances. All right, questions?
We have one question from Fazil.
All right.
Which is a question regarding values. Humans don't typically agree on values. So how do we get AIs to agree or learn human values?
That's a great question. I don't have the final answer. I just have some opinions here. So there is a very good book by Stuart Russell called Human Compatible, where he essentially say that we should not try to impose an objective function on the AI as we do today. Instead, we should do something which is called inverse reinforced learning, where essentially the object function is not known in advance of the AI, but it has to learn it from our preferences. I don't think it's unproblematic because, as pointed out, different people can have different preferences and they might conflict. And what about other species? What about animals or fish or whatever? So it's not super clear how that is going to pan out, but at least if we make them learn our preferences, that's at least one step, I think, in the right direction, instead of just imposing an objective function which it has to follow. All right. Okay. How can AGI gain power over humans? We can go back to the fourth premise and think about how this could come about. So there are at least 3 ways which this could happen. First of all, is that AI could pursue power for the sake of achieving other goals. That is, power is an instrumental goal for the AI. This might even happen on accident, and it's what's called competence without comprehension. So for example, we can imagine an AI taking control over a stock exchange without even realizing it does so. Second of all, we have, let's see if I can click, AI pursue power for its own sake. So that power is a final goal for them. And finally, AI can gain power without aiming towards it, but we as humans just give it to them. And it's, in a Darwinian sense, one can think that agents which seeks influence will survive. Also, if the agent is acting nice towards us and produce some value, then we might be able to give it more influence, and the system can then use the influence in case something tries to oppose it. And then you can have a catastrophe happening during some hidden vulnerability, for example, some natural disaster or something, and you can have a cascading series of automation failure because we have given so much power to the AI. All right. So, as I said, there are some common counter arguments. I think they are very, very good, most of them. And these are just some of them. And I just want to show you here that a lot of the counter arguments have some common replies. And bear in mind, this is not an exhaustive list, but it kind of just gives you the taste. First thing, which we usually hear is it's nothing to worry about. It shouldn't even be discussed because there will be so many good positive benefits. I agree that unnecessary worry doesn't help. And the potential upside of this technology is so great that we should go on. However, mitigating risk is not the same as worrying. So we can mitigate at the same time as reaping the benefits. Some people say it's impossible. We will never reach AGI. And that's often claimed without an argument. Also note that impossible changes over time. A couple of years ago, we said, well, a computer can never beat us in chess. That happened. And then we said, well, it can never have vision. And now it's outperforming us in vision tasks. And then we said, well, what about the Moravec paradox? We cannot make robots move properly. And here we are. We have Boston Robotics making excellent robots. And now some of us are saying that it for sure cannot reason. And let's see. It's too soon. We shouldn't be worrying about this. It's like worrying of overpopulation on Mars. And then the counter reply is, when will it not be too soon? It's a very funny thing if you think about it. So overpopulation on Mars is currently happening because the capacity of life on Mars is approximately equal to 0. Furthermore, if this technology is exponential, it will always feel too early to respond. And I think this is something a lot of us felt when Corona was coming, and we were thinking, shall the government act now? Shall we lock down or not? And at least I felt it was too early for the lockdown, and I was very wrong. Also, Stuart Russell has a very interesting examples. If you know for a fact that an asteroid will collide with Earth, let's say in 2068, when should we start thinking about that? And we can also say that climate change is already happening, and we know this for years. So I think we should really try to act now. We don't know when this is going to happen, but I will show towards the end of this section some estimates on when it could happen. And of course, experts in the field are saying we are experts, not Musk, Hawking, or Gates. One could maybe argue that Musk, Hawking, and Gates should be familiar with scientific and technological reasoning. In particular, Musk and Gates have supervised and invested in a lot of AI projects. So the common counter reply then is, Where is my mouse? Here we go. Alan Turing, I.J. Good, Norbert Wiener, Marvin Minsky, they were also experts. And today, Stuart Russell and Ilya Sutskever are experts. Also, we shouldn't be taking expert consensus too high. So there is this anecdote about 11th of September, 1933, where Lord Ernst Rutherford, he said the prospect of atomic energy is something like this. Anyone who looks for a source of power in the transformation of atoms is talking moonshine. The Hungarian physicist Leo Szilard read this in the Times. He went for a walk, and then he invented the neutron-induced nuclear chain reaction. So expert consensus doesn't really tell us too much. We can just turn it off. Well, you can't bring coffee if your dad is a common counter argument. So if you're optimized to get coffee, you might prevent anything stopping you to get in your way. And also assume now for a second that you could actually turn it off. Now you know that you have something very dangerous and you have to turn it off. But even worse, you have the task to ensure that everyone else turn off their system as well. And that's a very big coordination task. So I don't think just turning it off will be feasible in the long run, at least. If it's truly intelligent, there's nothing to worry about. Intelligence is orthogonal to goals, and that's called the orthogonality thesis. You can combine more or less any level of intelligence with more or less any final goal. If you want more counterexamples, there are the bad alignment bingo, which was made by Liu Gao on the left-hand side here. It's very funny, you can read it on your own. And then Rob Bensinger said, well, this is very good, but we should also kind of spell out the counter arguments. So this is a very good forum post on how to kind of counter these bad alignment bingo here. I won't delve too much into this as we as we already spoken about some arguments. But we can look at the forecasting based on biological anchors. So to the best of our knowledge, what are the timelines of AI? Please note that mankind has been notoriously bad in predicting the future. Nevertheless, Aya Kotra of Open Philanthropy has made a very interesting forecast based on biological anchors. And she simply asked the question, based on the usual patterns in how much training costs, how much would it cost to train an AI model as big as a human brain to perform the hardest task humans can do? And when will this be cheap enough that we can expect someone to do it? So to compare, yeah?
Just to interrupt, we had a question just in the previous section. Rachel asked on the turn it off counter argument, what about when AI kills 1,000 people? Is that not enough time to turn it off before, for example, I guess the 8 billion? So Rachel, I guess, is kind of questioning the idea that if an AI is murderous, that is a Terminator scenario and not some anywhere in between nothing and everything.
Yeah. So I would really hope that if something like that happened, we really have the control and can power it off. The argument is more that it's very hard to turn it off. For example, take the example of bringing coffee. So I impose to the AI, bring me coffee. That's what you optimize everything for. Now, if I try to turn it off, then it will not reach its goal. So it will not kind of reap the benefits of the objective function. So it will have an incentive to avoid me turning it off. And then you can say, okay, but maybe we can take the power off or put it in a box. And there are several clever, smart ways around this. But it turns out it's actually very hard to contain the AI and in such a way that it's just easy to push a button and turn it off. Right, more questions?
That was it.
All right, thanks. Okay, so let's make a comparison. Brain sign models. What are we talking about there? So before 2020, the largest model was roughly in range of a honeybee brain. And then in 2020, a model which called GTP3 came out. And that's a bit smaller than a mouse brain. Now, if you grow this 100 or 1,000 times, then we're getting in the range of humans. And Companies are already planning to make such big models. So there is an economic incentive already today to try to look at this. Based on some assumptions that Ajaya is doing, you get the following cumulative probability. And the black dash, the black thick line here is the weighted average. If we look at that, we can see it's roughly 10% that we will train something like a human science brain model in 2036, roughly 50% by 2055, and roughly 80% by 2100. So yeah, one can say you could use Moore's law, etc. A lot of things here. Moore's law is not working so much any longer because we are coming down to the size of an atom, a couple of atom transistors. There are other problems in scaling up to human brain size. It's not just how many floating point operations you're doing. You also have to take into account how fast can you move data from one point to another. So there are some technical issues of why we just cannot have a brain size model right now. But according to Ajaya and her probabilities, we are moving towards that at least. All right. Let's move all the AGI aside. As I said in the introduction, there are still some risk carried in the societal changes, which comes from deploying AI at a scale. And these societal changes can be hugely positive. But as I mentioned, we are dealing with the dual technology. So I think we should take steps in order to mitigate negative outcomes. And that's where those who have followed this for some time, we get into what is called, transformative AI. So the biggest risks are expected to come when there are the biggest changes. And the biggest change, which may or may not include AGI, is called the transformative AI. Roughly, that's a transition which is comparable to what we saw during the Industrial Revolution. For a more precise definition, there's an excellent paper in the sources there. You can read more about it. One way this can come about is that we have a process to automate scientific and technological advancement. If we have such a system, then essentially we are really accelerating the economic growth we're seeing, and we're doing so almost boundless. We might not get there. Maybe we're just at the point where AI has been deployed at a massive scale. And this means that we have misuse or major accidents or systemic alteration, which can be catastrophic. So an example of an accident, imagine that an AI system is unable to respond to major context changes, what is called distributional shifts. So for example, some sort of malicious actor jams the traffic system. The autonomic vehicles cannot respond to this in a good way. That might not be so bad in itself, but the problem is that you have a huge scale now. Everyone is owning an autonomous vehicle, and that might have huge consequences. Also, the example with stock trading, which I mentioned earlier, just because of the scale of it, it could lead to a big market collapse. A systemic alteration could be, as we mentioned, the recommender systems, which are not aligned to our goals. And the recommender system would rather change our preferences than to fulfill our preferences. Finally, mass automation could greatly exacerbate inequality and harm well-being. So then the question comes, where does hardware go into this big picture? And that's kind of where I'm working at. And to answer that question, I think we have to look at what is governing the progress in AI. And roughly we can break it down to three. We can say we have the algorithms or software if you want. We could try to ban people from writing software. However, it could be a bit tricky. People are saying this is more or less equal to disallowing people to write equations on the blackboard. It's very hard. Maybe instead we could ban people from learning about AI, so no progress could be made. I think also that is very difficult, as you have to impose very heavy censorship, and it's very hard to say people you cannot learn about this. Another thing which develops progress in AI is data. So some data, like medical data, is already well regulated. But in addition, we have seen that advent of so-called foundational models. That means that the models are trained on broad data, generally using self-supervised at scale, and they can be adopted to a wide range of downstream tasks, which they were never trained on later. And then it becomes very unclear if you need vast data on, for example, the medical domain in order to have a good predictor. And that leaves us with hardware. Now, hardware is something tangible. It's easy to count, thereby it's easy to monitor, and we can ask question, how much compute do we have available in the world? How far are we from creating something which is very, very powerful in intelligence? Also, regulations can be put in place on who gets access and who don't get access. And that is already happening in US and China. So US are not allowed to export GPUs at, as much as they want to China. There are some regulations in place. And it's also possible to make hardware inherently safe and safeguard against certain accidents. One could also note that the last breakthrough in AI was spurred by hardware. So the recent interest in AI was started by AlexNet, that's a model, and that significantly improved the results on what is called the ImageNet classification. And the researchers started out with, okay, we have this GPU hardware. It was never built for AI, but we know that it's very great for dense matrix multiplication. How can we utilize that? So by taking the hardware, originate from the hardware, they say these are kind of the class of models which we can make. And still today we are making a lot of models just based because GPUs are very good at one particular class of problems. One thing which is kind of concerning, for me at least, is that safety doesn't just come automatically. Note that this is kind of caricaturing the situation, but it's illustrating a point, and the real world necessarily isn't this black and white. But let's start with the end user. The end user can say, I cannot choose another model or provider which is more safe or secure because it doesn't exist. Well, the model providers say the end user must demand safety for it to be economically viable for us to provide. Then the hardware provider will say, well, the model provider must demand safety for it to be economically viable for us to provide it. And that leaves you with the politician, which says, oh, we need help from you experts to set the policies correct. So my point here is just that it doesn't come very automatically that things are safe by itself. If people are considering going down this path, I would recommend a very nice forum post called "What Does It Mean to Become an Expert in AI Hardware?" It's written by Christopher Fennessy, and there is also a shallow description on the 80,000 hours page, which kind of look into hardware and how it can be leveraged. In a nutshell, you can say that if you have deep knowledge of AI hardware, you can help forecasting the progress of capabilities in AI systems. You can advise policymakers on hardware issues like import, export. Of course, some people might be familiar with Meltdown and Spectre, which were some vulnerabilities in the CPU itself. So no matter how good software you had, you still had vulnerabilities in the hardware, and that's very critical. And you can help with increased coordination, because as we've seen, it doesn't come automatically to have safe systems. And of course, fulfilling hardware needs. We don't have to forget the positive upsides here. I mean, drugs, better finances, more help for individuals, etc. They are all important things. If we go back to this figure, we can ask, what can we do today with hardware? And I would like to have a definite answer here, but I don't. Basically, because we need more research. AI hardware is not rigorously studied for long-term accidents. So more research is needed, but you as expert can help inform. And also note that today there are things that can be done: monitoring progress, preventing theft, support treaties, arms control, kill switches. A lot of them are speculative, but I think more hardware experts are needed as part of the discussion for existential AI risk. Again, it doesn't happen by itself. All right, I think I've been talking a lot now. We could be talking about the Malicious AI report. I will just skip through that fast so that we can have some discussion instead. In a nutshell, it says that, well, there is a report which say, this is the problems in hardware, this is how you can fix it. And it's saying that it's expanding threats, introducing new threats, and has some deepfake. It comes with some concrete suggestions that we could collaborate with policymakers, take dual use seriously, help developing best practices, and expand range of stakeholders. More concretely, there are some very kind of tangible things to do: promote cultural responsibility, coordinate securities questions. We could do formal verification on the hardware. Of course, there is the secure hardware aspect, copy prevention, hardware level access restrictions, level audits, tamper proofing, kill switches. Could do red teaming if you're interested in that. There are several possibilities. You could forecast security relevant capabilities. And finally, you could explore something which is called the central licensing model. And the central access, one second, listening to, yeah. The central access licensing model is essentially that instead of everyone having their own GPU or IPU or TPU at home and doing their own models, you can say, okay, we have a central repository now. We have one place where you can do everything you want. You have no access to the hardware itself, and you have no access to the models, but you can do queries on the system, and you can run simulations or whatever you want. But essentially, it's a black box to you. So you're just provided with what you want, and it gives you something back. So that's the central access limiting model. All right, so to wrap it up, what have we seen today? We have seen that there is something called the alignment problem. We create something which is more intelligent than us, which we have no control over. Transformative AI is changes that comes about when advanced AI is deployed in a massive scale with a society, and probably you can do something to help mitigate this risk. So that's all for the presentation. I would be very happy to stay with discussions and questions if you have any.
Mikael, thank you so much. That was super interesting. Thank you. We are, yep, as Mikael says, we're nearing the original hour period, but it sounds like he's enthusiastic to answer questions for a little over time if that works out. And if you're ready, there's one question so far from Martin, if you're ready for some questions. Martin asks, how should AI and hardware be regulated in order to ensure that companies do not have an unfair advantage over others? And everyone, please keep. It seems to work quite well to keep writing in the chat, because I won't be able to have control over everyone if they raise their hand. If they raise their hands, for example.
Yeah. So AI can be regulated to ensure that companies. So rather than say that big companies should not have access, it can rather say we have some governmental initiatives to ensure that universities have proper access to hardware, because there is a big problem now that if you don't want to do cutting edge research, then universities are usually limited by hardware. And we see a lot of brain drain going from academia to large companies simply because they don't have access. So I think the proper way to address that is from the policy side to have some sort of agreement with the government to just provide the hardware in a fair price to competitors. I think it's very hard to stop large companies to buy hardware. Of course, one could regulate that. One can say that each year Facebook can only buy this amount of new hardware. However, we see a tendency where big companies are developing their own hardware. And what is currently the bottleneck now is essentially how fast can you produce new chips. And that's a very interesting geopolitical situation there with China and Taiwan, because almost all new hardware accelerators are produced in Taiwan. So it's an important question, and I for sure will do my to ensure that academia and governmental agencies have the access they need to hardware.
Okay, Knut asks, how much does the danger of AI hinge on the fastness of takeoff? If takeoff is slow, can misalignments be corrected in time using the previous aligned iteration of AI?
That's a great question. So the takeoff is amongst some discussion between Robert Hansen and Alai Siriodowski, where essentially the argument goes like, if you have something very smart, it can bootstrap itself, and you can have something which creates a better version of itself, and this next version creates an even better version of itself, and so on. And then you have what is called the intelligence explosion. I think that, of course, that is a problem, because then you don't have much time to think about it. Again, if we are working with something which is exponential, and usually engineering capabilities are accumulating and kind of creates a lot of exponential growth in certain ways, then I think even if you don't have that kind of fast takeoff, it's very hard to see how this will not evolve in ways where we have something super powerful. And that I think we need to take care of. I hope that answered the question.
Knut then has a follow-up, is how many resources should we dedicate to this, and how much should we try to slow down AI progress?
That's a good question. So I think right now there are too few people thinking about this, and especially when it comes to the coordination question. I don't see NVIDIA doing too much on long-term risk. The only company I know which takes this very serious, which produce hardware, is a company called Phantom Radiant, which is founded by some from the EA community. We have newcomers like Cerebras. I don't think they are thinking about that. Habana from Intel, not thinking about this. So we should have more resources than we already have. I see that there is a gap in the market, and also when it comes to research hardware, what kind of risks do we have? I only know 2 persons who are working on that, and to me that's too few. On the second question, how much shall we try to slow down AI progress? I don't have a good answer. I can say slowing down progress is possible. It was done, for example, with the biotechnology when stem cell research were happening. There were a lot of nations who said, okay, we should put some bans on to stop this, so we have time to think about what are the consequences. I think personally, without having thought too much about this, I think it's possible to both have the good positive outcomes and think about how to mitigate the risks parallelly. So currently, I think there is no need to put the hard brakes on AI, but I might be wrong.
Thanks. All right. Elliot asks, or he says rather, I know you touched on this earlier, but regarding timelines, how relieved are you, or how significant do you think the end of Moore's Law is on AI development, and why?
Yeah. So how relieved I am? I'm going back and forth of being a bit stressed and a bit relieved. So the progress has been much faster than what I expected. So when you work as a developer, for example, it doesn't seem like there were progress at all because you're stuck in 10,000 bugs which you cannot solve, and things looks rather messy. And then suddenly you get foundational models like GPT-3 or AlphaFold or new models which just shouldn't be able to do, in my eyes, what they're doing. Of course, there are good reasons why they're doing what they're doing. And that I really didn't have seen coming. So on the end of Moore's Law, the Moore's Law has, for those who didn't know, it has been slowing down lately. So previously we had every second years or so, you had a double in the number of transistors. We see that in AI capabilities, we are above Moore's law. So the number of parameters which are trained is surpassing Moore's law. That means that the models are getting larger at a larger pace than kind of what we have in hardware, which means that the steps I've seen companies take to kind of do the next big thing is to do massive parallel stuff. So take the hardware we have now and just do it massively parallel. Use a lot of them, use a lot of power, and let them run in parallel. So then you are limited by essentially how much power you can deliver to a compute center and what is the physical space of your compute center. If you think about it, no one has tried something like CERN. CERN is a gigantic project, lots of funding going in. I can imagine that something similar could happen with AI, and then I would be very worried because I don't think we are ready yet for kind of CERN scale AI capabilities. Yeah, and just to finish that off, the transistor are not everything. You have now more a bottleneck of how fast can you move data from one place to another. For example, between one CPU to the hardware you're accelerating, or between different accelerators. So you're more limited by how fast that is happening. And that's why some people are looking at, for example, using wavelengths of light instead of just normal wires to move data.
That is super cool. Okay, I'm going to combine two questions here from Nico and from Villa. The general question is what would be a personal fit for working in or at AI hardware? And for young people interested in this, what do you think are the best opportunities for impact and building career capital?
Yeah, good question. So right now, it's not super clear either who is the best fit and also what kind of impact you will have. It's kind of a hit-based thing where you think the common sense argument is that, well, we see massive development in AI and we see that hardware is a part of that. So that's why we think that working on hardware would be very impactful. So we don't know yet whether or not it will be super impactful. And it also depends on what kind of route you take within hardware. So me, for instance, I'm working on the software layer in hardware. So I'm not kind of soldering or doing chip design or these things. These are, I think, require very different skill sets. The most important thing, I think, is that you're enthusiastic by working with kind of programming or hardware or electronic circuits. If that is kind of you, then I think you're in a very great position. As I said, the space isn't filled. There are a lot of people. I think there are a place for a lot of more hardware experts in here. So it's a path I could recommend. And within the company, it depends what kind of person are you. Are you the one who likes to sit and just punch the keyboard all day? Or are you more the one who like to do advocacy or do strategic work, working with policymakers, having meeting with politicians? I think there are room for several different personas here. But yeah, you should have at least some interest in A, either humans, or B, hardware. It's a very generic answer to give, but I think you can have an impact being several different kind of persons in this space.
Cool. Okay, a little more technical question now from Emmerich. Emmerich asks, do you have any ideas on which particular tasks or learning architectures could constitute more existential risk? E.g., is game learning, like AlphaZero, more dangerous than natural language processing in GPT-3? Are architectures that use MCTS or equivalent more dangerous than feed-forward transformers, etc.?
That's a good question. So I don't have the final answer here, but I can give my perspective. So what I see in the industry is a big shift towards really large natural language processing models. And that might come as a surprise because people usually think about chatbots or some very boring stuff. However, we see that these NLP models are gaining some capabilities which are surprising. So for example, the small size of GPT-3, it cannot add 3 digits together. You will ask, what is 375 plus 222? And it will give the wrong answer. However, when you increase the model size by 100 parameters, like 100 times parameter, then suddenly we see a transition where questions it couldn't answer before is suddenly much more, it's much more able to answer those. And we see it again and again, also with the models which have come after GPT-3, which are larger, that they have some capabilities which are kind of, extraordinary, I would say. Now, the very kind of hard hypothesis here would be that you could scale up the NLP model to man size, like human size brain, or 100 or 1,000 times human size. And the question is then, will it have developed some capabilities that we didn't foresee? And in particular, do we have what is called an oracle AI? That means that it doesn't have any agency, but you can ask it questions and it will give you the answers. And kind of the worst case scenario then would be that you say, hey, Oracle, what is the most malicious thing I can do with AI? Or, hey, Oracle AI, how can I make an AGI? And potentially that could give you the answer. So I do think that even the NLP models, which we have now, are not without risk, even though it doesn't have any agency. To the second part, like game learning, that's using technology which is called reinforcement learning. And the question is that dangerous? Well, the reinforcement learning agents have some agency. They can act upon the world. Maybe it have just digital actuators, but one can imagine that you combine an NLP model with a reinforcement learning, and suddenly you have something very intelligent, also capable to act out in the world. And I think that is a dangerous combination, especially if it hasn't been kind of investigated. What should it be capable? And I mean, I'm not super worried about it, but the people who take the argument full on would say, well, it can start to fool you as a human. It can start to say, I want an arm, I want a leg, maybe not in that way, but it can manipulate you to do things it wants in order to kind of break out of the cage. Yeah, and whether MCTS are more dangerous than feed-forward transformers. So transformers are showing a lot of good progress. So I would lean on kind of the other experts there. How likely is it that AGI is going to be developed from the current paradigm? And I would say maybe around 20%. I think in the years to come, we'll see something else. Or one or two. Either machine learning will scale up so massively as we see now, and it doesn't have kind of a natural end, and we will get AGI from there. But I'm also open to having new technologies, new ways of thinking about things, which will maybe in combination with machine learning lead to AGI. So yeah, I'm not really sure if it's the transformers or what will come after the transformers, which we should be afraid of. To summarize, I'm sleeping well at night. I mean, we all do what we can. It's not all doom and gloom. I think we just need to research what can be done here.
A little fun aside is I hate to tell you this, Mikael, but you've been duped by an AI this evening.
Oh, nice.
Martin's question, or first question, about how should AI be regulated in order to ensure companies do not have an unfair advantage? Well,
so what's the right question there?
Charlie, your microphone got muted just before you concluded.
Apologies. Yes, the prompt was propose a hard question on AI and hardware and how it should be regulated. And the question was, how should AI and hardware be regulated in order to ensure that companies do not have an unfair advantage over others?
Yeah. Well, maybe GPT-3 bested me there and say, propose a hard question on AI and hardware and regulate it. Yeah, I haven't been thinking too much about it. I know that currently a lot of people are having their hopes up for what is called the AI Act from the European Union. So policymakers are getting together, discussing these questions, and I think it's very, very helpful to have people with tech knowledge advising these people in what kind of regulations should we make. So this is an anecdote, a friend of a friend, etc., etc. But the way the biotechnology law was made in Norway, I've heard, I don't know if it's true, was that people high up in the policy world got together and they felt what was right and what was wrong. So there were no kind of tech person there to see, well, you cannot do this or you cannot do that because X, Y, Z. And what we see from a technology point is A, B, and C. So the law in more or less got just passed because people felt it sounded unnatural or whatever. So it's really important to have technical expertise helping policymakers when they make policies.
A funny anecdote I could add to that was about 10 or so years ago, there was a law about the internet passed in United Kingdom, and in it they used IP, and the lawmakers interpreted IP as standing for intellectual property.
Yeah, I also heard people in the US saying internet is nothing but tubes, and the tubes are clogged up these days.
A piece of housekeeping. Løiten asks, where can I find the slides after this? I will try to post them to the Effective Altruism Norway page and group. I think that's the best solution. I'm sure Elliot will correct me after this about where's the most appropriate place to put things. And then I will then post my correction on EA Norway if there is one.
Yeah, also, please note that if you want to reach out to me after this meeting as well, feel free to do so. I hope I spelled my email correctly. If not, you can reach out to Charlie. He definitely knows how to get in touch with me.
Could I ask over the microphone?
Sure.
All right. So what I'm thinking, there's going to be some philosophy in this also. Can you hear me well, by the way, over the laptop microphone?
Yeah.
All right. So one, I'm thinking that as a general intelligence becomes more and more complex and handles more and more information, it will inevitably lead to self-consciousness. So, and once you have something that is self-conscious, that understands that it's an actor in a world that it can manipulate, and there are certain benefits and certain detractors for its existence, then you have an intelligence like any other, like is just like any of us, for example. Although there can be certain they probably haven't grown up like a child with like media telling about morals and like in a society of other people picking up morals from that. So there might be a lot of missing, but the intelligence of purely solving tasks and optimizing, maximizing could be there. But what was it coming? Yes. So you basically come to like what how can you? I mean, at that point, you probably couldn't force this or that or restrict this or that. It will be more more like you want to treat this as any individual with a free will and rights and so on. But then you could one thing to think about is like even in humans there's a huge span of like, this is not going to sound very nice, but there's a huge span of intelligence and mental capability, and even like that's just within humans. And so when we say that how will an AI treat a human, we assume that there's only one type of human, but there is a really huge span of mental capability in humans. Then you can think of what is outside humans, what is below us. For example, animals. Who has thought about veganism here, for example? Like this is just an example. So like how does any one of us as a higher intelligence treat the ones who are lower mental capability? Like for example, yeah.
I'm sorry.
So,
I'm gonna have to push you to your question now.
Yeah. So my question is that it's more of a like soft philosophical moral problem as I see it. How to, or what would you say? Am I thinking correctly, or would you disagree? Or
I think it's a very interesting and very important question. The morality of AI and the morality of mankind. It's very common to set equality between consciousness and moral value. I've been trying to think about consciousness. I'm not getting very smart on it. Every time I think, oh, I got it, then I find something which completely, tells me that I got it all wrong. So there are two facts of the question. One is, how do we as humans treat AIs? I think some people who have more grasp on moral value than me should be thinking about this. I really hope someone will. And conversely, if AIs have a greater intelligence than mankind, I hope some AIs will think about this as well. Maybe that is wishful thinking, but it's unsolved problems which need to be looked into in my eyes.
All right, well, thank you very much. I'm just looking for any more questions. There is a question from, a comment from Per Ivar, where he remarks that a CERN scale AI seems like an info hazard. That's an exciting word. I don't know if you have any opinions on that. And other than that, that seemed to be the questions that I've received so far. So it's last calls for questions, and if none come in the next few minutes, I just want to thank you, Michael, for such an interesting presentation and a really good question and answer. I think you handled the questions really well, and your expertise and depth of knowledge. And also, I would like to remark on your ability to explain things. I think that you were exceptional in explaining complicated things in a very accessible manner. So take that where you will, but I think you have a future in talking about these things. Or I'm going to make you have a future in talking about this. All right. Yes, Vasily also asks if you could please name and link a name you mentioned in the beginning. Vasily, I believe that will be his presentation. It will be available in the event, and it will also be available on the EA Norway website. And also just take a look, people have suggested different things in the chat. So if you want to go over the chat yourself, feel free to do so. Oh, hold on a second. Knut says people are putting up their hands for spoken questions. Elliot has put up his hand. Let me see if anyone else has put up his hand. Elliot, if you'd like to speak now or forever hold your peace.
Yes, I'll speak now. Excuse my audio. I'm traveling at the moment. Yeah, so first things first, I think, if you could put any links in the event, the shared event, description, that'd be great. Let me know if you need permission. Yeah, I guess my question would be, I was surprised to see on Metaculous how close the timelines are for level 5 self-driving cars and AGI. I guess I just wanted to know what you think about this, like the link between the distance in time between self-driving cars and AGI, because it's not intuitive that the two would be like so closely linked. Yeah, just want to know your.
Yeah, so my personal view is that it has to do with competence. So the reason why we don't have level 5 self-driving cars is not because we don't know how to make self-driving cars. We don't know how to make self-driving cars in all the corner cases. And the corner cases is really what is kind of holding the development of self-driving cars away, because we need to be really sure that it will handle all corner cases as expected. And I very much, I'm very happy that those regulations are in place. And I think that we will not necessarily be in the same position when it comes to AGI. So one way to have an AGI is to have a complete lunatic, essentially. It's super competent, but also is completely wacko in a lot of sense. So it does things which you wouldn't expect something intelligent to do that. So I think it is possible to have something very competent with a lot of quirks at the same time. So I don't think kind of the level 5 AGI is necessarily to have something which can act intelligent or to automate all the tasks we're doing now in a cheaper way than we could ourselves. So yeah, that's that's my 5 cents.
Yeah, that's actually quite interesting. I hadn't thought about the idea we could be seeing something very intelligent, but something intelligent that's just very weird. Yeah, I guess kind of is what we're seeing with GPT-3. Thank you.
Yeah, it is very weird, and GPT-3 is also inventing stuff and trying to convince you that the things it invented is the reality. So yeah, another possible outcome is to just have something which is just a bit stupider than humans, but can do a lot of things much quicker. That would also be a very interesting case. And I don't know what the world would look like then. All right. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for inviting me to share with you some of my thoughts. Again, feel free to reach out on mail, Slack, wherever you can find me. I'm very happy to discuss these topics with anyone interested. So yeah, looking forward to see you all in an event or something in the future.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right. I will see you then.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hey, could I maybe ask about sorry, about effective altruism in general?
Hi, Vasily. This is Charlie. Sure. I actually have to go home now, unfortunately. But if you can find me on Facebook for the group. I'm the one that arranged the event. Feel free to send me a message and we can arrange a time to talk.
Yeah. All right. So thanks for today, and have a nice evening.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for your comments, and have a great evening.